friends, welcome back to Telltale. I'm Emily.
I'm Greg.
And today we're going to be talking about approaching classic science fiction. This is a topic one. This is not necessarily a singular book review.
Right. I'm going to talk a lot about a lot of different stories from back in the day. And, classic science fiction, the term classic means something different to everybody. I've heard people talk about books that were published in the 90s as classic.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Usually I hear the term cult classic with those. Because they kind of have
I've heard some science fiction books like Children of Time referred to as classic science fiction. It's like, it's not that old, guys.
Yeah. It's like A Wrinkle in Time isn't that old, really, but it's classic, too.
Well, I mean, that one was around when I was a kid. It was in school.
Yeah, but
So
still,
that's a
that's
little
not like,
older,
that's
but-
still not too long ago.
No.
But yeah.
So, to clarify, for me, when I'm talking about classic science fiction, I'm pretty much talking about anything before 1970.
Okay.
And that covers a lot of different types of science fiction, but you can pretty much lump it all together and put it in front of one of today's booktubers and have them read some of it, and they're going to go, I don't like this stuff. It's not, there's no world building. There's no, the characters aren't very strong. It's like,
There's a lot of sexism and racism and allusions to weird things like the Cold War.
and there aren't any, this isn't totally true, but you'll hear a lot that there's not many women protagonists.
Mm-hmm. And there aren't.
Well,
There are, but there aren't.
there were fewer, but I mean,
They were
Dr.
out there.
Susan Calvin
Mm-hmm.
in the 1940s by Isaac Asimov.
Yep.
Female protagonist. Okay. It's out there.
Yeah.
You can't write off all the science fiction before 1970 as being against feminist principles when the authors were clearly, there were women writers, Leigh Brackett, C.L. Moore, Mildred Klingerman, Judith Merrill. There's some others that aren't popping into Zena Henderson.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's how Zena or Zena, Z-E-N-N-A. I don't know.
Zena.
Anyway, there were a lot. Idris Seabright, another science fiction writer,
Mm-hmm.
female science fiction writer. Andre Norton, that sounds male, but
Female.
Lots of women writing back then.
Mm-hmm.
And some female protagonists, even some stories where the women kind of are stronger. I'm trying to think of specific examples, but and they're not popping into my head because I'm old, not because they're not there.
I'm thinking of like Death World and stuff where they have a pretty strong female protagonist.
That was 1960.
Secondary, yeah, but still like
Mhm.
pretty strong female in that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was pretty badass, shooting things up and
Muscular as
beating people
hell,
up and, yeah.
destroying that which destroys. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. So, the criticisms that I find from people today about classic science fiction, I feel that's completely inaccurate, and that it's just a case of that what we call classic science fiction now had, it was a certain type of literature that was different from other works of literature. It had different goals. And Star Wars kind of destroyed all that. And Star Wars became super popular and catapulted space opera up to the top of the science fiction heap. And the older type of more thoughtful science fiction then
More philosophical,
started
really.
just not being read by people.
Yeah.
So now you have generations that really have known nothing else but space opera, which actually
is kind of
predates,
kind
goes
of
back
becomes
to the 1930s.
stereotypical.
Yeah,
After a while.
and they've been raised on Harry Potter and Wheel of Time and Twilight and stuff like that, and very character-centric stories, and that just is not what science fiction was about before 1980. In the 70s, things started transitioning a bit, but you still had a lot of stories that were very idea-centric in the 1970s.
Yes.
And you still get some after 1980 as well that are more like the classic science fiction.
Mhm.
But people today really are more into space opera, is what it comes down to. You like space opera, it's what you're used to, it's what, it's what you grew up with Star
Mhm.
Wars, it's what you fell in love with.
It's drama.
So these
It's a
more
drama.
dry, thoughtful, philosophical, idea-based science fiction stories, just, it's not what you're used to.
Yeah, it's not what
It's
the culture,
different.
is used to now, for sure.
So, I've read a lot of this stuff, and of course, I grew up with this kind of science fiction, and I liked it because it was thoughtful. I liked it because of the ideas. I really didn't give a rat's ass about the characters.
Mm-hmm.
The people were just there to propel us to the idea. It's the big revelation at the end that made the story.
Yes.
A book like 2001, you have characters, but those characters aren't really what the story is about.
No.
It's about all of humanity,
Yes.
not about one person.
And the development of a planet.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does there's like several points that really makes. It's the psychology of humans. It's the psychology of artificial intelligence. It's the psychology of, or it's like the science of what in different atmospheres would the beginnings of life look like. Like, there's so many different subjects that whole trilogy as a whole touches on,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't care that it's like the protagonists perpetuate the story, but it really isn't their story. There's a bigger overarching story that keeps popping up that is the arc, essentially. It is the canon. It is the whole plot.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't about the people.
Right.
And I love that. I love it.
Now, another big misconception about the golden age of science fiction is that it was all John Campbell. Okay. John Campbell was important because he came up with a new type of science fiction that was more idea focused and a little more, not totally accurate, but more accurate about science. At least it didn't go off the deep end into stuff that was just totally impossible.
Yeah. You didn't have to lean on plausible deniability so much.
And so a lot of his writers were engineers.
Yes.
Like Milton A. Rothman, that I've just got a book of his stories and am reading. He was instrumental in developing nuclear power plants.
Yeah. Isaac Asimov was a very, very famous scientist.
Mm-hmm. Though he didn't actually do much science. He got his
There
professorship.
are some of his journals on Project Gutenberg that are
Yeah.
very interesting. There's one on the psychology and physiology of, what was it? Radiation on on humans.
Mm-hmm.
That was really interesting that he wrote with someone else.
Okay.
I read it, part of it. I didn't get through the whole thing. It's very dense, but
But in the
interesting.
1940s, he got his associate professorship of biochemistry at Boston University and then made an agreement with him that he wasn't going to actually
Do anything.
He was going to go off and write.
Yeah.
And they bought it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then he went and he wrote, but he wrote tons of, he was brilliant and he researched the science and he knew how to talk about the science in a way that other people could understand. So he wrote all these books about science and just was a great writer that way.
Yes.
But if I recently went through and put his bibliography into the Telltale website, his fiction bibliography, and it's pretty slim. Especially in the 1940s, especially in Astounding. He didn't publish all that much with John Campbell.
Huh.
And then I've been entering bibliographies from some of the other authors, like Theodore Sturgeon, L. Sprague de Camp, who were, Robert Heinlein, who were all very instrumental in the Golden Age. And so much of their work either wasn't with Campbell at all, or wasn't in Astounding. It was with the sister magazine Unknown, which specialized in fantasy.
Interesting.
So a lot of these authors were writing stuff that wasn't science fiction, and when they did write science fiction, half of it was being published in Astonishing Stories with Frederick Pohl, or Planet Stories, or Thrilling Wonder Stories, or Startling Stories. It wasn't even published in Astounding.
Interesting.
Very, very few of the authors actually significantly published with Astounding science fiction.
Why? Do they have a
I don't know.
why? Maybe maybe he was just being a dick then. Who
Well,
knows?
it's hard to say not having lived
Mm-hmm.
back then. A lot of people do say he did push really hard at his writers, and he
Mm-hmm.
did reject anything that didn't live up to his high standards.
Mm-hmm.
So then the writers, if they wanted to make any money off of what they've just wrote,
Mm-hmm.
that they've spent time writing, and he rejected, they have to go to one of the other magazines.
And propose the
And the other
story,
situation
yeah.
in the 1940s is that, well, you had the war. A lot of the writers were drafted, so they weren't doing much writing between
Mm-hmm.
1941 and 1945.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also, you didn't have much of any other magazines. You had Astonishing, you had Amazing Stories, you had Thrilling Wonder Stories and Startling Stories and Planet Stories and Astounding. And that's pretty much the whole field
Yeah.
at that time. And you couldn't go to book publishers. They weren't interested before 1948.
Yeah.
They didn't publish science fiction. So, so when the late 40s came, UFO craze started.
Yeah. Welcome to Roswell.
And Hollywood picked up on that and started making science fiction monster movies.
Mm-hmm.
And so the book publishers also, they suddenly wanted science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And all these authors had all these other markets open to them. They kind of left Astounding all at once.
Mm-hmm.
You know, also at that same time.
Screenplays. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
They were getting paid better and they had more
Mhm.
options. And also at that same time, Campbell kind of went down the Dianetics path with
Yeah.
L. Ron Hubbard, and everybody was going, he's lost his mind. Let's go publish somewhere else. You know, so you saw quite a few authors just leave Astounding in
Mhm.
like 1948, 1949, 1950.
To avert
And-
the cult.
Yeah, and they
Essentially.
didn't come back until Campbell cooled it with the Dianetics in the late 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So the Golden Age, very, very little of it really has to do with Campbell and Astounding.
Yeah.
A lot of the great stories were published elsewhere. A lot of the authors were publishing elsewhere. A lot of them left Astounding the first chance they got to publish elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it, you know, he had a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
And he forged that idea, and some great stories came out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But he was not the whole Golden Age.
No.
And the whole Golden Age wasn't about that one type of story. So
Yeah.
much of what was written was not science fiction being published in unknown. Or when Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction came out, they were publishing there. They were publishing Weird Tales, which was being published the whole time.
Yeah. He was just one of the glowing embers of the fire that became the science fiction movement.
Yeah.
Really. He was just... Sometimes I wonder if popularity is based off how loud and dramatic sometimes the publishers are.
Mhm.
And Campbell seems like one of those people who, because he was picky and because he made decisions and was very hard on put pressure on his writers, that he kind of formed a reputation that made him almost notorious more than popular.
Mhm.
It seems. Not like in a super negative sense when you think of notoriety or being notorious for anything, but in a sense that people regarded him highly because of his passion for what he did. And he was somewhat charismatic from what I understand.
Yeah. But he also, he started writing at the beginning of the science fiction magazines.
Mm-hmm.
And he very quickly, at 18 years old, became one of the most popular writers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was Campbell, there was Williamson, there was Edmund Hamilton,
Mm-hmm.
and the others were all somewhere beneath those three.
Yeah.
So
around.
he was one of the most popular writers of the 1930s. And then
So that he became a big deal.
1937 or 38, he gets the editorship of Astounding, which was the most popular magazine, had the most money behind it, was paying the writers the most money at the time.
Highly competitive.
Everybody wanted to be in it,
Mm-hmm.
and Campbell was now the editor. Everybody needed Campbell. And he was very popular and very well known within science fiction fandom at that time. So he had all the cards
Yeah.
stacked with him.
He just got the luck of the draw, so to
Mhm.
speak.
And so he had a really good idea and he was able to push it.
Mm-hmm.
But the
Life
authors
happens.
took that idea and ran with it and created some great science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you have to understand that there was a lot more going on at that time than just that one type of science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But that one type of science fiction was important because it did create a fiction that was different from anything else. You know, space opera was just like H. Rider
It was a
Haggard
pioneer
in
work.
space.
It was
you know,
the
it was
pioneer
Zane
work,
Grey
yeah.
in space,
Yeah.
with a bunch of weird machinery and weird creatures. You know, along comes Campbell with this idea of let's write these. You know, we're calling it science fiction, but there's very little real science to this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Astounding when it got started before Campbell was editing it, made the statement that it was going to do these thought variant type stories,
Mm-hmm.
but they never really followed through with it very well until Campbell took over, and then he
Mm-hmm.
started doing it with his own fiction at first, with like Who Goes There,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the greatest
Oh,
science fiction
fantastic
stories.
science fiction story. Loved that
And
one.
the other stories that Campbell wrote under his Don A. Stewart pseudonym
Mm-hmm.
were this new type of science fiction that he had in mind. And he was talking to people like Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, L. Sprague de Camp, Lester
The
Del
best
Rey,
of the best.
Van Vogt, Jack Williamson, not Edmund Hamilton so much, but, you know, all the most famous writers of that time.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking to them about this type of fiction and saying, this is what I want for my magazine.
Mm-hmm.
He was paying the most. There wasn't much of anywhere else to go.
Mm-hmm.
They wrote his kind of science fiction.
Yep.
And in doing so, they created a literature that is not like any other because it's a literature where the idea is king.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else serves the idea that you're trying to put across.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was based on science.
Yep.
It didn't always have to be accurate science, but it had to have some kind of scientific springboard,
Mm-hmm.
something that they were reading in a scientific or engineering journal and going, well, what if
Yeah, that's a neat
100
idea.
years from now this developed into this?
Yeah, what if we take this curiosity and throw it into this scenario?
Mm-hmm.
Throw some ethics in there. Question some big ideas.
Yeah.
Or don't question the big ideas.
And some of the science was wrong, but it created situations where humans had to react to it.
Mm-hmm.
And created this experiment where you can now study how human beings are going to react in certain scientific situations. What if we have a weapon that can destroy the world?
What do we do with it? And why
How are
does
we
it
going to
exist?
react?
Yeah.
How is it going to change us?
And why was it made?
Mm-hmm. And that thought experiment of how
Mm-hmm.
these different situations are going to affect human beings and human societies.
Mm-hmm.
That's the more important thing, is that a scientific development doesn't just affect one person, it affects everybody, it affects all of society. And so that's what they're talking about in these stories, is how things are going to change because of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what if everybody has flying cars?
Yeah. The accidents are much harder because you have the inner accident and then you have the accident on the ground.
Mm-hmm. But what if we all had flying cars? How would that change our society, our economy, our laws, our outlook,
Mm-hmm.
our freedom?
Yeah.
I mean, you can fly to Japan.
And how high do you fly?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm
All
sure
the questions.
personal flying cars would be like
Yeah.
a
Don't go to
Piper
space.
Club
Yeah.
airplane. It can't go up to 30,000 feet, but, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that does bring up a lot of interesting questions. Because, like, even the invention of the motor car, the philosophical question had been posed where it's like, well, will we become lazier because the car exists?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, yeah, we have, but
Yeah.
our productivity has changed. The dynamic of productivity has changed because of the motor car. So
Mhm.
productivity would just make another change, I suppose, with a flying
But it
car.
also affected our world in that it made oil king.
Yes. Yes.
where everything is about oil.
Mhm.
Oil controls the
Fossil
economy.
fuels are the biggest resource that we utilize as of
Mhm.
right now.
Yeah.
And nuclear energy, the pros and cons of nuclear energy is another one that I think a lot of like science fiction can touch on. And like
And did
yeah.
before. I mean, they were writing stories about atomic bombs before there were atomic bombs,
Yep.
and getting in
Knowing
trouble
that
with
the
the
science
FBI.
was going to happen, yeah. So, yeah, it does bring up a lot of questions. But I think that kind of questioning was important to happen before its time too, because would we be able to question it in the moment had it not been brought up prior?
Yeah, you know, it is important to think those things through before we actually put those technologies out there, instead of just doing the technology and throwing it out there, and what happens happens. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah. That
We-
seems like
we-
a really bad way
Yeah.
to just let it watch the train wreck.
Well, I think to a certain extent we've done that with things.
Oh
Companies
yeah,
have
we have
developed
of course.
products and put them on the market, and it turned out that they had toxic chemicals or whatever, or they had to dispose of toxic waste in the manufacturing process, and
Yeah.
nobody thought through to create some kind
Anybody
of process for dealing with
Following
that. They
the
were
Oxy,
just, well, we'll just dump it out back.
yeah, the Oxy trials and anything like that, we'll find that out very quickly.
So science fiction was a great way to kind of do those little psychological thought experiments of how are people going to react when this change, if this change comes about in this way. You know, what will we, you know, how will we all act the day an alien spaceship lands and says, we're here?
Oh gosh, it's gonna be fucking chaos.
You know, what if SETI picked up a true, honest to God alien signal tomorrow?
That would be so crazy.
How are we gonna take that? And that's what science fiction is all about. But it's not about one person. It's not about two people falling in love. It's about whole societies.
And sex even within the society. Like you're gonna have those who are pro and those who are con. You're gonna have people who are kind of in the middle.
Yeah.
You're gonna have people, but I mean, scenarios like that too would have such big feelings. I don't know that there really would be a middle ground. You would just have the extremes. Oh, so interesting. I like that.
So they created a whole new literature that focused on the big historical movements, not on the individuals. And that's what science fiction was all about, really, from H.G. Wells all the way through the 1970s, with the caveat that the writers at the same time were writing a lot of other types of fiction. Some of them were, you know, Frederick Brown is well known for his mysteries. L. Sprague de Camp is probably better known for fantasy than for science fiction. Theodore Sturgeon wrote a lot of, actually most of his stories got published in Unknown in the 1940s. And so less science fiction than you would think for somebody who was considered primarily a science fiction writer.
Yeah.
You know, and later on, Harlan Ellison, he hated trying to be categorized as a science fiction writer because he would wake up one day and want to write fantasy, or wake up the next day and want to
Just
write
kind of felt
horror,
peckish
or wake up
about
one
one
day and
genre
he
or the
wanted to
next.
write about street gangs. You know, he didn't want to be pigeonholed into having to write about spaceships every time he sat down to write. He wanted to write whatever popped into his head. And so he really hated that genre classification. And I can see that. But, you know, how do you sell a book if you can't target a specific group of people?
Yeah. Sometimes you
Yeah.
have to brand in a particular way.
You can sell a book really easy if you have fairies with magic,
Every
having
time.
sex, and fighting battles. You can sell that book.
Sex,
real easy
drugs,
today.
and rock and roll.
Okay, there is
But
a market
fairies,
where
yeah.
they are looking specifically for fairy smut.
Very smart. Yes. Very smart.
And so if you write that
Alien
book, you
smut.
can sell it every time.
What was that one romance novel that I sent you guys the link to? Where it was the cows.
Oh,
And
yeah,
oh gosh. The humanoid cow.
the milking farm, it's
Yeah.
they're minotaurs.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, half bull, half
I don't
man.
know who they're milking. Probably the humans. Anyway, yeah, romance novel. Furries.
That's
Big
pretty
thing.
messed up.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, if you write for a specific market, you can sell it, and that's the marketing thinking behind publishing. If they've got a book that has these certain points that they know people are going to go, oh, witches, I got to read that.
Yeah.
You know, whether
my
they
market.
whether
Witches,
they
yes.
know the author or
Necromancers,
not.
yes.
You know, time travel. I got to read that. I love time travel stories. You know,
Lesbian necromancers in space?
Exactly.
Yes!
You know?
1,000% yes.
It appeals to people who just are triggered by those certain things, and makes it very easy to sell books that way.
Yes.
When you have somebody like J.G. Ballard that, well, he published in science fiction magazines, but very few of his stories can actually be called science fiction because they're more surreal, they're more absurdist, they're more fantastic. They're not like anything else that was being published at the time. William Burroughs is another one that we got to get to one of these days.
Yes.
As soon as I buy us some copies, we'll read Naked Lunch, and that's another one. How do you market a book like that? Who does it appeal to? People on drugs. In the 1960s, you could sell William S. Burroughs.
And acid.
And you could sell 2001: A Space Odyssey because you had that culture. But today...
And if you read it reads like high literature while you're on acid. I don't know from experience. Please don't quote me on that.
Seriously. But that isn't a genre. No. There isn't a genre for William S. Burroughs or J.G. Ballard or Michael Moorcock is usually put in the sword and sorcery genre because his main series about Elric was sword and sorcery.
Experimental.
But, well, he was the first one to create a multiverse.
Yeah. The multiverse.
All of his story, he had this character that would show up in all of his novels, but with a different name, a little different situation, different world. Some of them were near future thrillers, some of them were sword and sorcery, others were high fantasy, pop up in all these different genres, but it was always the same character of the eternal champion.
Interesting.
And he ran this thread through everything he wrote. Still is writing. He's still alive, still writing. He's publishing a new book this summer. I believe it's another Elric book, if I'm not mistaken. He's still publishing, so he's still going. And everything he writes, even though he writes all these different genres, they all relate to this whole multiverse concept he created.
That's interesting.
And he was as far as I know, he was the first one to do something like that.
And then people like, Stephen King kind of do a similar scenario where all of his stories are in the same universe. That's interesting.
Except I feel like King kind of wrote a bunch of books, and then at one point he came up with the idea of trying to tie them all together, and so now he's been trying to
find ways of sneaking it in and out and through and around.
Where Moorcock actually had this concept from the beginning.
Where it would begin with the end in mind, so to speak.
The hero with 1,000 faces, basically, and repeating that through all of his books.
Yes.
Philip Dick is another one where he has these common themes that run through all of his stuff, but he didn't create a multiverse so much. There are some connected novels toward the ends of his career, but it's not like they all are connected.
Yeah, they're not all the same.
It's not a multiverse. There's just some common themes that run through his stories, which we've already been seeing in the short stories we've read. Yeah, and we're going to see those same themes kind of repeat through his work, but get more intense. And
seeing the versatility of a question is what I'm really excited about. Like, a science fiction can take so many different directions of posing the same idea or question or circumstance. Like, there are so many dystopians novels out there in the scientific genre, especially more modern sci-fi. Yeah. They're all so different in so many ways, and there are so many different original ideas that pair with this idea of what does a dystopia look like? Yeah. And how do people react to it? Or like, what does a utopia look like? And how do people react to it? Like, what are those? What does that become? And you see this throughout literature, that you could take the same idea and have so many different variations.
Yeah.
And that's what I appreciate about the golden age, especially of sci-fi, where they start posing those questions, but sometimes another author is like, I'm going to take that question and I'm going to take it in another direction.
Mm-hmm.
I just really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
What a trailblazer.
Yeah.
What trailblazers.
So, well, and another author that got his start in Astounding, but he published a lot for Astounding for the first 20 years of his writing career. But he also wrote a lot of other stuff, and that's Poul Anderson.
Yes.
You know, he wrote a lot for Astounding, but he also published in Planet Stories, and he also wrote straight out Norse fantasies.
Yeah.
And
I have a few at home.
okay.
I found
Which
the thrift
ones?
stores. I can't remember.
I know
I just see Poul Anderson and I'm like, I'm going to start collecting.
Well, I know you got a lot of his Ensign Flandre
Yes.
stories. Those are space opera.
Yes. I do have those.
And actually, I have the issue where the very first of those stories was published.
Ooh.
I think it was Planet Stories.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, he wrote a wide variety of stuff. He wrote a lot of fantasy. He wrote a lot of space opera. He wrote a lot of hard science fiction. He was a versatile writer, you know, who was, you could still easily call him a science fiction writer, because that's the bulk of what he did. And the bulk of his science fiction was more traditional, hard science fiction or space opera.
Yeah.
So it's very recognizable, very easily marketable. But then he'd throw something like Three Hearts and Three Lions out there. Or forget the name of it. There's one where he has these warriors from medieval Norse background. They get thrown forward in time and they end up in New York City. And it's
Connecticut
comedy.
Yankee.
Yeah, but
King
opposite.
Arthur's Court.
And
the other way.
This is a comedy.
Nice.
It was actually made into a movie in the 1990s, a kind of a bad movie, but the book is a
B-rated
classical.
movies are making a comeback.
Well, I don't think this even managed to reach level.
C-rated movies even are making a
I
comeback.
enjoyed it. It was a fun movie. It just was very low production value.
Yeah.
And you know, the story is hilarious and brilliant, but it's science fictional but fantasy at the same time, and comedy. It's kind of how do you market this thing?
Yeah.
How do you pigeonhole it? It's so classic science fiction isn't one thing. It's a lot of things.
Yes.
And all those things have developed into what you have today. But the core Golden Age Campbell hard science story, first of all, is mostly a myth. There are some stories like that, but the majority of stories, even Campbell published. I mean, he published a lot of stuff about psionic powers.
Ooh.
You know,
that'd be kind of cool.
Mind powers, which of course is just total crap.
Telekinesis.
He published the first Dianetics in Astounding.
Yeah.
You know, this stuff isn't science.
No. It's metaphysical, if anything.
Yeah, so there's a lot of that going on too. There's a lot of mind control, mind reading type stuff that has no basis in real science. But it was in the pages of Astounding in the 1940s, and the subject of a lot of the best stories that came out of the magazine, the most exciting stories like Slan or Weapon Shops of Isher, or even some of L. Ron Hubbard's stuff. Was very good to read, very fun reading back then.
Yeah.
It just wasn't real science. So there's a lot of myths about classic science fiction. But the one big myth is that there's no characterization. We've read, I mean, in a short story, you're limited how far you can go with character, but we have read a number of stories that had some really excellent characters.
Yes. Yes, we have.
You know, stuff that was published in Astounding in the 1940s.
Yes.
So it's out there. I mean, it follows Sturgeon's law, 90% of it is shit, but then 90% of everything is shit. So, finding that good 10%, it's there. You just have to take some time and dig for it.
Yes, and it's really difficult
and
too.
And watch our channel where we will give it to you.
Yeah, we'll just hand it to you on a silver platter.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah. But I think, too, there's also this concept, like any creative work or art or authorship, anything, like books, it's all very subjective. You got to find what you love.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get thrown an outlier as well. Like, I haven't read a lot of romance novels or anything that I've liked.
Mm-hmm.
But I still keep trying because one might actually blow me away someday.
Well,
we
don't
know.
Don't put down the people who do enjoy it.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
their- it's their escape.
It's not my thing, and other people are allowed to
Yeah.
enjoy it. That's the big thing, is making
And
sure
if
that you
your
let people
thing
like
is-
things.
If your thing is all the fairy smut books, then go for it.
If
Enjoy
you're a
'em.
furry lover, go for it.
You know, we've read ACOTAR. We thought it was good. We thought it was really good.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it.
Mhm.
Go and read that. If you don't want to read the other stuff, that's your choice.
Yeah.
Just don't put it down, because there are people who find great things in it.
If you put it down in the context of why you think it doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
I would not shame anyone for liking any particular piece of literature, with some exceptions. I mean, like, there are some really heinous things people have written, but like,
Well, and you, if your thing is Harry Potter, don't put down Isaac Asimov. Just don't read him. 'Cause
yeah,
he's not your thing.
Yeah, if he's not your thing, it's okay to try things, but don't sit here and say he's a terrible author, like, because he's not. He's fantastic
At what he did.
at what he did.
But
It's
what
like
he did
trying to, like,
was not what is being done today.
Yeah, don't judge a fish by how it climbs a tree.
Exactly. I want to see that.
Yeah. I don't know. But yeah, definitely. Anything else we want to touch on for Golden Age of science fiction and approaching it?
I think that's it. Just, what we always say, read what you love, give things a try, be open-minded, understand that it isn't of your generation, it isn't the product of your world today. It is a product from a world that is very different, where the values were very different from what we have today.
Yes.
And so you have to be a little bit understanding about some of the situations in language, because it was the norm back then. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody thought they were hurting anybody. Everybody just did it.
Yeah.
And beyond that, understand that the literature of yesterday is not aiming for what we're aiming at today.
Yes.
It had
But it's
its
still not
goals.
obsolete either. It has its place.
It had different goals. It had very intelligent goals. That's
But it still has things that are relevant.
what
now.
always burns me is that we always seem to approach the past as if all the human beings that were before our generation were total idiots and knew nothing.
They were just people learning like us.
There were certain things they hadn't figured out yet,
Yeah.
but they were, 2,000 years ago, people were just as intelligent as we are.
Yes. They are just learning based off new information a lot of the time. And that's the whole thing with science and science fiction, too, is we're still learning science. It has that nothing is officially set in stone as of yet when you think about it. Yes, there are laws, but things can change. Like,
Yeah.
there are still things we're discovering, like Pluto wasn't a planet, and then it was planet again.
Well, that's just semantics.
Yeah, it's semantics.
It's-
yes, but
it's a big round
it's based
rock,
off of new
like
information.
every other planet,
Yes.
moon, asteroid, gas giant, star. Well, not star, but
Yeah. Yeah. So what we're running into is new ways of defining things, new things we're learning based off evidence, new concepts, things that once were may not be any longer. Like, there's a new cloud just dropped, by the way, that was not a classification of cloud, and I can't even remember what it's called. But that's Earth science. We've lived on this planet how long, and just recently started identifying this cloud formation, even though it's existed as long as humans have. Like, science is still developing ways of identifying things, labeling things, figuring things out. So the genre is too.
Yeah. And the science fiction genre grew up at a time where it became very apparent that science and technology was really changing our lives.
Yes.
And so these authors developed a fiction that explored that basic concept of what if.
Yep.
And it isn't about individuals. It is about big ideas, big changes, whole societal changes, whole historical changes. It's bigger than one person.
Yes.
And so character was downplayed for a reason. Some authors found ways around that problem.
Yeah.
and were able to come up with ideas that were central to the development of a character
Yes.
and could put deeper characterization into their stories. Like More Than Human is a great one for that.
I'm
with
just
Theodore
thinking of
Sturgeon.
like the Space Odyssey books where we get more about David. Just because his personality being so corporate and cold was done intentionally. And it's explained later as to why he was chosen for his position because of his personality and why he had that personality.
Well, and the initial decision to do that had more to do with the discussion between Kubrick and Clark about these big historical periods and developments that are more than just an individual.
Yes.
But you still need to follow an individual
you still have to have...
to tell the story. How do you do that? And that's what they came up with was
Yes.
2001.
And it was
where
a great
Bowman
marrying.
is a metaphor
Yes.
for all of human society.
Yes, and it is a great marrying while still giving you a very human person who, though, behaved inhumanly and then eventually became pure energy and not human anymore, but still had memories of being human. I thought that was such a great way of developing that character, but also developing the society around him and this understanding of the society around him. Really well done.
It's an interesting point, though. Do we have memory of being Neanderthals or earlier? I mean, maybe some of our habits come from that, but do we really have a conscious mind of what it was like to be?
Do we have a consciousness
at
of
that
instinct?
And of course, a lot of people are going to say, "Well, no, that's evolution. Evolution is crap. We were, we all came from Adam and Eve." I don't want to. I'm not going there.
Yeah.
I'm just taking the scientific view here. And
yeah, we're talking like if we are putting it in the context of science.
Yeah.
And this is one of many theories in science. Yeah, do we have an awareness of instinct?
Yeah,
Is
well,
almost.
but I mean, when you apply it to 2001, when we become that star child, will we have a memory of what it was to be what we are now?
Yeah.
I
mean, we play with that idea in religion,
it'll still
too.
Be some part of us deep inside, but I don't think we'll have a conscious memory.
Yeah,
of,
people play with that question, too, in theology as well. As like, when we die and go to heaven, do we have memory of what Earth was like? We don't know. We don't get to know.
Yeah.
And science doesn't get to know either. So that's the one part of science that hasn't been touched on, the mind.
But science fiction will go there.
Yeah, they'll go there for sure. And it is fun to play with. So, but yeah.
So,
anything else?
No, I think we've beaten the horse.
Yeah, we have beaten the horse. But good dialogue and good conversation, because this is a lot of context that I don't have going into science fiction. I go into a lot of these things that we're reading together blind with my constitution, my culture that I come from, my generation that I come from. And I just love the dialogue that we can have, because knowing that and still having this fresh perspective is so interesting, because I'm piecing together what is still relevant.
Yeah.
Because there still is, like, for how different humans are, we are also very much the same. And I think that's really interesting when you start putting it in the context of science fiction and how they started playing with the ideas and how we continue to still play with the ideas. Just now with more characterization, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting. So,
Yeah,
good stuff.
Our whole world is a little more focused on the individual than we used to be.
And I don't know if that's to a detriment or not. Read some Ayn Rand and find out.
Well,
anyway.
if she's right, we're all in trouble.
Oh, no. But yeah, still worth a read, though. Very interesting concepts. Controversial. So, well, thanks for joining us, guys. Like, subscribe, give us your commentary, if you have any, on the golden age of science fiction, and compared to modern science fiction.
Or classic science fiction all the way up to, like, 1970, which is more than just the golden age.
Yeah, more than just the golden age. And just, let's play with some ideas. Let's have a dialogue. Thanks for joining us. Like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.